She traded herself for shelter. The lonely cowboy gave her a home and a future she never dreamed of. The sky was a bruised violet when Maybelle came walking into Whistle Hollow, her hem heavy with dust and her eyes dull as river stones gone dry. The wind whistled through broken shutters and rusted fence wire, catching her thin shawl like a hand tugging her backward. But she kept on, boots worn thin, steps neither rushed nor slow, just steady, like a woman who no longer feared where her feet would carry her. The town was little more than a cluster of wooden bones left creaking in the sun, a general store with a sagging porch, a chapel leaning into itself, a saloon whose light flickered like a dying breath. No one looked up when she passed except a child peering through a cracked window, his fingers pressed to the glass, as if he'd never seen a woman who looked so much like the end of a story. She paused near the well and drew a sip from the tin ladle. It tasted of rust and ghosts. Her hand trembled slightly, but she steadied it, jaw set, spine straightening though her heart still sagged in her chest. There had been a time she'd have prayed. Now she did not waste words on empty sky. Silas Mercer's saloon was the only place open after sundown. Warm light spilled out like spilled whiskey, golden and harsh. Inside, the air smelled of smoke, sweat, and something more bitter, a kind of hopelessness that clung to the floorboards. Maybelle stepped inside and let the door close behind her with a sigh. Silas spotted her before anyone else. He always did. Tall, slick-haired, with a mustache too sharp for his round face. He leaned against the bar with the ease of a man who owned everything he saw. He looked her over without apology, taking in the torn hem, the raw hands, the eyes that held no shine. "You lost?" he asked, voice like spoiled syrup. "No," she said. That was all. He waited. She didn't explain herself, didn't ask for water or bread, just stood there, the way a woman does when she's done asking for kindness. Silas chuckled low, shook his head, and tipped his hat back. "You'll be wanting shelter then." She didn't nod, but he took her silence as agreement. Everyone did. "Upstairs," he said, thumbing toward the narrow staircase. "Room on the left. Ain't much, but neither are you." She went. The room was a narrow box of stale sheets and moth-bitten curtains. A bed, a chair, a cracked mirror. She sat down on the edge of the mattress and looked at her reflection. Her face was gaunt, the skin pale except where the sun had blistered her. Her eyes were too old for her years. She touched her cheek, as if to memorize herself before whatever came next. No one asked her name. No one cared. By morning, she had earned her place. Not with grace, but grit. No tears, no pleading. Just a quiet acceptance that turned men's appetites cold. She scrubbed floors, washed linens, fetched drinks, and made herself smaller than she'd ever thought possible. The other women avoided her, not out of cruelty, but because they knew what it cost to survive that way, and they couldn't bear to see it mirrored in someone new. Days passed like wind over stone, wearing her down, not changing her much. At night, she would lie on the thin mattress and stare at the water stains on the ceiling, counting the seconds between footfalls in the hallway. The silence between them was the only peace she found. One evening, as she swept the porch with the twilight falling soft and lavender around her, a figure approached on horseback. He came from the south trail, riding alone. No dust cloud behind him, just the slow clop of hooves against tired earth. The man didn't speak as he tied his horse to the post, didn't look twice at the saloon or its women. He had a scar cutting down from his temple to his jaw, pale against sun-browned skin, and his eyes, though unreadable, held a depth that did not judge, only saw. Maybelle stopped sweeping. The man nodded once, and she returned it. It was nothing. It was everything. The first time someone had seen her and not looked away. He disappeared inside, silent as wind. She heard no laughter follow him, no boast or swagger, just the clink of glass and the scrape of his boots across the floor. Later that night, after the bar had emptied and she sat by the hearth nursing a bruise on her wrist, she found a small tin left beside the door. Salve. No name. No note. She looked out into the dark, half expecting to see someone there, watching. But the street was empty, just dust rising in curls like forgotten prayers. The next morning, she was sweeping the steps again when a crate of supplies arrived, heavier than she expected. It slipped. Cans spilled. She cursed under her breath and knelt to gather them. A hand reached down beside her, rough-knuckled, scarred, gentle. She looked up and saw him, the quiet cowboy, picking up a tin of peaches without a word. He handed it to her, their fingers brushing for a breath longer than needed. "Thank you," she said, unsure why her voice came out so soft. He tipped his hat. That was all. Then he was gone again, walking with that steady, unbothered gait. A man who owed nothing and asked for even less. Silas saw the exchange from the window. That night, he was harsher than usual. Told her not to get ideas. Said no man wants what's been passed around like bread at supper. She didn't answer. Didn't even flinch. But when she returned to her room, she found a folded cloth left on her pillow, clean, mended. Not hers. That night, the wind howled over Whistle Hollow, bending the trees like sorrow bending the soul. Maybelle stood at her window, holding the cloth in her hands. The moonlight turned it silver. She was still nothing in the eyes of most. Still a woman traded for shelter. But someone somewhere had given her something that wasn't asked for. Something that wasn't a payment. Just kindness. And that, after all she'd endured, felt like the beginning of something. Not love. Not yet. But the first crack in the walls she'd built so tall. She didn't know his name. But she would learn it. And he had seen her. On the outskirts of Whistle Hollow, with a prairie spread like an old quilt stitched in gold and gray, there lived a man named Jonah Callahan. Folks in town knew him more by myth than truth. They said he'd come from the West Hills after the fire that took his family, that he hadn't spoken a full sentence since. They said the scar down his face came from a branding iron or a cavalry blade or maybe his own shame, depending on who you asked and how much whiskey they'd had. But Jonah didn't live by stories. He lived by routine. Up before the sun, saddle his horse, feed the cattle, muck the stalls, mend the fences, ride the border of the land he'd stitched back together from ash and emptiness. His ranch sat low in a hollow of cottonwoods, where the wind blew gentle and time forgot to rush. He'd built it with hands that didn't shake, though the past often tried to make them. He didn't come to town often. Once a month, maybe, for salt, nails, oil. He never stayed long. Folks respected him the way they respected thunder in the distance. Quiet, unpredictable, and best left alone. When he did speak, it was low and measured, like his words cost something. On a day when the wind carried dust and silence together, Jonah rode into Whistle Hollow just past noon. The saloon's porch groaned under his step. He didn't look at the girls leaning in doorways or the men nursing mid-morning bitterness. He went in, bought his supplies, and sipped one drink, untouched by the noise around him. That's when he noticed her again. The woman sweeping the steps. The one with the tired eyes and the quiet hands. She moved like someone who didn't expect the earth to forgive her, yet kept moving all the same. Her dress was clean but faded, her shoulders drawn as if waiting for the next blow. She didn't look at anyone, not until Jonah paused beside her, watching the broom trace lazy arcs across sunlit boards. She looked up. There was no desperation in her gaze, no flirtation, just a strange kind of calm, like a candle still burning after the wind had tried to kill it. Their eyes met for a moment longer than manners allowed, and Jonah felt something he hadn't in a long time. Stillness, not of the land, but within himself. He nodded once, the barest gesture, and moved on. The next few weeks passed in dust and sun. Jonah returned to his ranch, worked his fields, listened to the owls call through the dark. But every so often he thought of her, asterisked the woman on the porch star. The way her hands had gripped a broom, the way her mouth didn't smile, but didn't frown either. A strange grace in her suffering. When he came to town again, she was carrying a crate of supplies, too heavy for her frame. He didn't speak, just stepped forward, caught the edge as it slipped, and helped her lift it. Their fingers brushed. She looked up again, startled, but not afraid. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was softer than he remembered, like a song half remembered from childhood. He tipped his hat and walked away. Inside the saloon, Silas noticed. He always noticed. Jonah could feel the man's eyes follow him, calculating, possessive. Silas didn't speak, but his silence was louder than most threats. That night, Jonah left a small tin of salve on the saloon steps, tucked under the corner of the doormat. It wasn't much, just a kindness, the kind that didn't expect anything back. The next time he returned, she was at the well, drawing water. Her sleeves were rolled up, showing bruises the shape of fingers. She hid them quickly when she saw him. He didn't comment, just held out a folded scarf, soft cotton, pale blue. She hesitated before taking it, her fingers lingering on his. No words, no need. Something passed between them then. Not love, not even hope, but recognition. Two souls who had been through fire and were still standing in its smoke. The town, of course, began to talk. Not loud, but in the way small towns do, smirks, glances, whispers pressed into whiskey glasses. They said Jonah had taken a shine to Silas's girl, that he was looking to save something that couldn't be saved. But Jonah never looked to save anyone. He didn't believe in rescues. He believed in shelter, in quiet, in presence, things that didn't demand, only offered. One morning, he found her sitting on the church steps alone, long before the pastor arrived, her hands wrapped in the scarf he'd given. She looked like she was waiting for something she didn't believe would come. He sat beside her, leaving space. She didn't look at him, but her voice found its way into the air between them. "Do you think people like us get a second life?" she asked. Jonah's voice was low, slow, and used. "I think we survived the first one. That might be enough." She turned then, just a little, enough for him to see the lines at the corners of her mouth, carved not by age, but endurance. "Maybe I'm tired of surviving." He didn't answer, because there was no answer. Only breath. Only time. They sat there until the sun rose fully, washing the town in light too clean for the sins it hid. Later that day, Silas cornered Jonah behind a feed store. "You think you're better than the rest of us." Silas spat. "She's mine. Bought and paid for." Jonah didn't speak. He just stared, steady and unflinching, until Silas's mouth thinned and his fists curled. But he didn't swing. Maybe he knew better. Maybe he knew that men like Jonah didn't bluff. They endured. Silas walked off, but something in the air had changed. Tension, thick and sour, settled over town like a storm building slow. Jonah returned to his ranch and walked the perimeter, boots sinking in soft earth. He found himself glancing toward the road more than usual, listening for hoofbeats that never came. That night, he left the lamp burning in the front window, a quiet signal without a name. In the saloon, Maybelle stood behind the bar, hands raw from scrubbing. Her face was blank, but her mind replayed that morning on the church steps, the way he'd sat beside her, saying little but meaning more than most men do with sermons. She'd traded herself for shelter. She'd endured shame to stay warm. But for the first time, someone had offered her something different, not escape, but space. Not affection, but respect. And that felt dangerous, because it made her want. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat at her window, watching the road disappear into darkness. Somewhere out there was a man who said less than a sparrow, but made her feel seen. She didn't know what tomorrow held, but she knew she couldn't keep living in the same four walls, with nothing in them but survival. She touched the scarf on her lap, held it like a question she hadn't yet found the courage to ask. And in the far-off distance, out past the town, a warm light flickered steady in a cabin window, waiting. The night she ran, the air was sharp enough to bleed. Stars wheeled above like cold eyes, and the wind whispered warnings she no longer had the strength to heed. She left with nothing, no bag, no coin, not even her name spoken aloud. Just her breath, fast and shallow, and the coat Jonah had once forgotten on the saloon chair, the lining still faintly holding the warmth of his shape. Silas had pressed too far this time, anger drunk and meaner than ever. He grabbed her wrist with the same hand that had tossed coins across her bedsheet the week before, told her she owed more now. That kindness cost, that her face was still passable if she didn't fight. But she had. Not with fists. Maybelle wasn't built for brawls. She fought by walking out the back door and not looking back. She made it past the last lamplight of Whistle Hollow before her knees buckled. By the time she reached the old churchyard, where the grass grew long over forgotten graves, she collapsed beside the stone-marked wife, and sweet in song. Her body curled like a question with no answer. Morning light found her crumpled there, hair tangled, lips cracked. It also found Jonah. He'd woken early, some unease scratching at his ribs, and saddled his horse without knowing why. The road into town was silent, but his eyes caught the shape in the grass before the sun had fully risen. He dismounted slowly, like he didn't want to startle her, even though she wasn't moving. She opened her eyes when his shadow crossed her. No words passed between them. He didn't ask what happened, and she didn't offer. He just knelt, lifted her in his arms with the same quiet effort he might use to carry a broken fence post or an orphaned lamb, and set her gently into the wagon bed. She let herself rest there, wrapped in that coat that somehow belonged to both of them now. The ranch stood quiet beneath a sky that was thinking about spring. Fences mended tight, smoke curling from the chimney. No dog to bark, no woman to greet them. Just space, safe and wide. Jonah helped her down, but didn't guide her by the arm. He simply opened the door and stepped back. She crossed the threshold on her own. Inside, the house smelled of cedar and saddle soap. A fire cracked softly in the hearth. The floorboards creaked like old music. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, not knowing where to put her hands, her eyes. "This room," he said, gesturing to the left. It was simple. A bed with a hand-quilted blanket, a small writing desk, a window looking out on the pasture. On the desk lay a battered book of poems. The sight of it nearly undid her. She didn't thank him. Not yet. Gratitude was too sharp a shape inside her. Instead, she sat on the edge of the bed and stared at her fingers, as if waiting for them to believe where she'd landed. In the days that followed, they moved like shadows around one another. Maybelle swept the porch without being asked, washed dishes after dinner, fed the chickens. She didn't do it to earn her keep. Jonah never once implied she needed to. But her hands needed purpose, and this was gentler work than she'd ever known. Jonah gave her space. He spoke when needed, told her where the flour was kept, that she didn't need to ask before opening cabinets, that the barn creaked loud at night, but it wasn't haunted, just old. And when he wasn't working, he sat on the porch with a journal open in his lap, drawing tiny sketches of clouds or wildflowers or silhouettes of horses mid-run. She found the journal once, forgotten on the kitchen table. Flipping through the pages was like listening to him whisper without words. Careful lines, soft curves. A man who noticed everything, but said almost nothing. That night, she brought him a cup of coffee and sat beside him, not asking about the drawings. He didn't pull the book away. That was something. The rhythm of the ranch was slow, forgiving. Morning chores, quiet meals, evenings spent near the fire as wind kissed the shutters. They didn't fill the silence with chatter. They let it bloom between them like wild grass, untrimmed, honest. One night, as rain danced on the rooftop, Maybelle finally asked the question that had been blooming like a bruise beneath her ribs. "Why did you take me in?" Jonah looked at the fire for a long time, the shadows flickering across his scar. When he spoke, his voice was low, steady. "Because I know what it's like to be treated like something broken when you're just trying to survive." She said nothing at first. Then, very softly, "You don't seem broken." He gave a small shake of the head. "Not anymore, but it takes a while." Outside, the storm passed like an old memory. Inside, something shifted. She didn't touch him, but she leaned back in her chair, her body no longer pulled tight, like thread before the snap. The next morning, he found the kitchen warm with the scent of cornbread. She'd cooked, not as a favor, not to earn her stay, just because she wanted to fill the house with something good. He said it was the best he'd had in years. She laughed, just a little, and the sound startled both of them. It became easier after that. She took to riding, and he taught her without words, showed her how to hold the reins without straining, how to listen for the horse's breath. Their hands touched often, passing tools, lifting hay, steadying a saddle, and each time it felt less like a flinch and more like a familiar rhythm. She began to hum again, especially when hanging clothes or brushing the horse. He never said anything about it, but he always lingered nearby when she did. Still, neither of them spoke of what this was becoming. Not yet. They weren't lovers. They weren't even courting. They were two people growing toward one another, like trees leaning in the same direction, not touching, but rooted close enough that their leaves rustled in the same breeze. And somewhere between the silent breakfasts and fire-warm nights, Maybelle began to feel something she hadn't felt in years. Safe. One evening, while she stitched a tear in his shirt and he carved a new handle for a barn door, she looked up and said, "I thought I was done dreaming." He met her gaze, slow, certain. "Maybe you just needed a place worth dreaming in." She turned her eyes back to the thread, but her mouth tilted with the memory of a smile. That night, as she stood at the window and watched the moon rise over Jonah's quiet land, she wrapped herself in the blue scarf he'd once given her. Not because she was cold, because it reminded her of the first kindness, the first shift in the dark, the beginning of everything. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in years, she knew she wanted to find out. The wind had shifted. It came off the hills now with a bite, colder than spring ought to allow, curling under the door and brushing against the windows like something hunting entry. Jonah stood on the porch, one hand resting on the rail, eyes sweeping across the pasture. The sky was heavy with the smell of rain and something else, something wrong. Maybelle felt it too. She'd woken with a tightness in her chest, a quiet warning curled in her ribs. The hens were restless. The horse wouldn't settle. Even the dog that sometimes wandered down from the neighbors' fields barked once and vanished into the woods. She watched Jonah from the kitchen, the way his shoulders squared against the breeze, how still he stood. Then she heard it, the faint clatter of hooves far off, approaching fast. Not a trader, not a ranch hand, something sharper. The sound of a man riding without care for the ground or what might greet him at the end of the trail. She stepped out onto the porch just as Jonah turned toward the road. The rider came into view in a spray of dust and fury. Silas Mercer. His coat whipped behind him like a black flag. His eyes burned the same way they had that last night in the saloon, mean, entitled, wild with the fury of being defied. He didn't slow until he was nearly upon them. Then he dismounted in a single, furious motion, letting the horse lope off, unbothered. Jonah moved first, stepping between her and the man, without raising his voice or his fists. Just presence, quiet, immovable. Silas spat into the dirt. So this is where she ran. Took what didn't belong to her, and now hides behind your damn silence. Maybelle's heart pounded, but her feet stayed planted. Jonah didn't speak, but he didn't move aside either. Silas's voice cracked with the chill and the wind. "You think she's something worth keeping? Think she won't turn on you like she turned on me? She's used to being taken care of for a price." Jonah's jaw flexed. Still no words. The silence made Silas madder. He stepped forward. Jonah blocked him. They were nearly chest to chest now, but the tension wasn't loud. It was low, simmering, like kindling catching just below the surface. "I want her back," Silas snarled. "Or I want my payment. Either way, I ain't leaving empty-handed." Jonah finally spoke. 3 words, steady as the horizon. "She's not yours." That was it. The line drawn. Silas reached for something at his belt. A flask, a blade, it didn't matter. Maybelle didn't wait to see. She stepped forward and said the words that had burned in her chest for months. "I was never yours, Silas. You didn't buy me. You just took what no one stopped you from taking." Her voice didn't shake. It rang, clear and sharp, across the porch and into the pasture. Silas looked stunned, for half a breath. Then fury overtook him. He lunged, not at her, but at Jonah. The fight was short, brutal. Jonah moved like a man who'd fought ghosts more dangerous than flesh. But Silas was wild, fueled by pride and liquor, and in the scuffle, the lantern Jonah had been refilling for the barn spilled its oil, and the flame took fast. Fire leapt up the side of the barn like it had been waiting, dry wood catching with a roar. Silas staggered back, coughing, fleeing without another word. He rode off into the smoke, the storm wind pushing him faster than thought. Jonah collapsed near the fence, one hand to his side, blood seeping through his shirt. Maybelle didn't scream. She didn't freeze. She ran. Buckets. well, water, wet blankets. She fought the fire with bare hands and battered breath, calling out to the sky, to the earth, to anything that could hear her. Smoke stung her eyes, burned her throat, but she didn't stop. Not until the flames gave way to steam. Not until the barn stood blackened but standing. Only then did she drop beside Jonah. He was still breathing, jaw tight against pain. When he opened his eyes and saw her face above him, smeared with soot and wet with sweat, he exhaled a sound that might have been a laugh. "You stayed," he rasped. She held his face in her palms, careful of the scar. "I told you, I want to dream again." He reached for her hand, held it. Nothing more. Jonah recovered slowly, days folding into one another like quiet prayers. Maybelle never left the ranch. She sat by his side, fed the animals, fixed what she could. The barn smelled of smoke for weeks, but it still stood, like them, scarred but unbroken. Neighbors came offering help. Not many, but enough. Jonah accepted with a nod. Maybelle, for the first time, didn't shy from their gaze. There was no shame left to carry. Spring softened the earth. Wildflowers pressed through ash. The porch filled with sunlight. Jonah began walking again, slow and sure, and she matched his pace step for step. They never spoke of love in grand declarations. There was no kneeling, no ring. But one morning, as they watched the sun rise over the pasture, Jonah reached out and took her hand. Not hesitantly, not accidentally, just naturally, as if he'd been waiting for her fingers to reach back for years. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I want to plant something this year," she said. "Not just for food. Something that blooms." He turned toward her, eyes steady. "We'll make a garden. Not just a house now. A home." She smiled, small and real. Sometimes people say love is a storm, a flash, a fury, a flood. But that's not the kind that lasts. Not the kind that heals. Love is the fire you survive together. The barn you rebuild. The garden you plant in the ash. And if you're lucky, it's the hand that never lets go, even when the wind howls and the past tries to follow you home. Somewhere out in Whistle Hollow, people still whisper stories. They say the cowboy took in a girl and gave her shelter. But the truth is gentler than that. He gave her room to become herself again. And in return, she gave him spring. If this story stirred your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell icon so you never miss another tale from the Wild West.